Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eric Eichhoff, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Director of Alumni Operations at John Carroll University. Thank you for joining us for our next installment of the virtual scholarly luncheon as part of the Growl Faculty Fellowship and the Alumni Continuing Education Series. We are excited to have you join us for this opportunity to connect with one of JCU's outstanding faculty members. Over the course of the last 2 years, the Office of Alumni Relations has worked to create innovative and interesting programming for our alumni, current students, parents, faculty, staff, and friends so that we can keep them engaged regardless of where we call home. Today's Scholarly Luncheon is just one more example of how JCU is sharing the expertise of its faculty, staff, and alumni with our broader community. In this program, we will explore climate change fiction, also known as cli-fi, which is a growing genre of fiction that addresses themes of climate change and global warming. Cli-fi concerns itself with anthropogenic climate change, that is, how human activity affects planetary change. While sci-fi works often portray other worlds in the distant future on other planets, cli-fi often focuses on the recognizable Earth that is threatened, if not devastated, by humanity's addiction to fossil fuels. This presentation will provide a lively introduction to climate change fiction, poetry, guide attendees through an example by looking at a piece of literature, and then we'll have an opportunity for questions at the end of the program. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to go over a couple other housekeeping items. For those questions, please utilize the chat feature, and I'm going to moderate them as they come in. And then also, we encourage you to utilize the full screen option to better experience today's program. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Debby Rosenthal. Dr. Debby Rosenthal received her Ph.D. in comparative literature from Princeton University. She recently returned from a year researching and writing in London, where she was a visiting scholar at King's College London. A winner of JCU's Colicchio Award for Teaching Excellence, Dr. Rosenthal is passionate about teaching students about American literature. She's the author of 2 books of literary criticism and has published numerous scholarly articles. She is currently writing another book and editing 3 more about climate change fiction. Dr. Rosenthal, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. How are you doing today?
Hi, thank you so much. I'm really pleased to be here.
Well, the floor is yours. We're looking forward to hearing from you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here and to be able to share with all of you what happens in our classrooms and in some of my research as well. So I would like to talk today about climate change literature and cli-fi in specific. So you perhaps have heard of sci-fi. So cli-fi is sort of similar, the idea of fiction that has to do with climate change. But climate change literature is broader than just fiction. There's poetry and playwriting, drama, journalism, and film as well. But I would like to start with Pope Francis, with his 2015 encyclical Laudato Si on care for our common home. It's a really beautifully written and impassioned document that describes the urgency that we need to care for our planet, for our common home. It's absolutely gorgeously written. Here is the title page for it. And I usually don't like to use blocks of text, but I thought it would be really useful just to look at a couple of passages that Pope Francis articulates as a way to kind of frame my talk and why this is so important at a Jesuit university. Now, in Laudato Si, all of the paragraphs have numbers to them so that you can commonly refer to any passage, whether you're using a book or on a digital edition. So, for example, here's paragraph 1, where it opens with Laudato Si, mi Signore, which is praise be to you, my Lord. So this encyclical opens with a prayer. And Pope Francis reminds us that our common home, he says, is like a sister with whom we share our life, and a beautiful mother who opens her arms to embrace us. Paragraph 2 then builds on this by saying, the sister now cries out to us because of the harm we have inflicted on her by our irresponsible use and abuse of the goods with which God has endowed her. We have come to see ourselves as her lords and masters, entitled to plunder her at will. The violence present in our hearts wounded by sin is also reflected in the symptoms of sickness, evidence in the soil, in the water, in the air, and in all forms of life. Pope Francis then goes on in paragraph 23 to discuss climate as a common good. So he describes this climate as belonging to all and meant for all. At the global level, it's a complex system linked to many of the essential conditions for human life. A very solid scientific consensus indicates we are presently witnessing a disturbing warming of the climatic system. So in this paragraph, Pope Francis is setting us up for these ideas of scientific rigor that he, as a spiritual leader, deeply understands. Here's a grab from paragraph 24 about the warming has effects on the carbon cycle. And climate change aggravates the situation, affecting the availability of essential resources like drinking water, energy, and agricultural production in warmer regions, and leading to the extinction of part of the planet's biodiversity. The melting in the polar ice caps and in high altitude plains can lead to the dangerous release of methane gas, while the decomposition of frozen organic material can further increase the emission of carbon dioxide. Things are made worse by the loss of tropical forests, which would otherwise help to mitigate climate change. Carbon dioxide pollution increases the acidification of the oceans and compromises the marine food chain. If present trends continue, this century may well witness extraordinary climate change and an unprecedented destruction of ecosystems with serious consequences for all of us. A rise in the sea level, for example, can create extremely serious conditions if we consider that a quarter of the world's population lives on the coast or nearby, and that the majority of our megacities are situated in coastal areas. Isn't sort of extraordinary language to come from a spiritual leader and, from the Pope, to really be diving deep into climate science. But then he switches in paragraph 25 to talk more about social issues, and especially for the world's poor. So climate change is a global problem with grave implications: environmental, social, economic, political, and for the distribution of goods. It represents one of the principal challenges facing humanity in our day. Its worst impact will probably be felt by developing countries in coming decades. Many of the poor live in areas particularly affected by phenomena relating to warming, and their means of subsistence are largely dependent on natural reserves and ecosystemic services such as agriculture, fishing, and forestry. They have no other financial activities or resources which can enable them to adapt to climate change or to face natural disasters, and their access to social services and protection is very limited. So thank you for bearing with me for that kind of lengthy excerpts from Laudato Si', but I think they're important for setting up some of our ideas, and because John Carroll University is about one of 130 or so campuses across the US that I have tried to get involved with the idea to be a Laudato Si' campus, to try to achieve goals specifically laid out in this papal encyclical. So we have many different committees. These are some of the goals. I'm on the Ecological Education Committee to try to help John Carroll move to be a Laudato Si' campus. And Pope Francis in Laudato Si' recommends that we need an inner transition to create the conditions for the energy revolution that's going to be required to curb climate change's worst effects. In scholarly circles, this is known as the affective turn. So like the turn to affect as a way to reshape the climate movement and to try to help set into motion the public will and to put into motion the solutions we know we already have, but we need an emotional understanding and turn to the social. And starting with Laudato Si' goals on a college campus is definitely one way. But how can we intervene, especially in the literary classroom? So this is where I want to tell you about a new genre of literature called climate change literature. It's really increasing in popularity on college campuses. And this is where authors are able to really invest their writing with themes of how human activity is changing the planet. It's different from environmental literature and nature writing. So when you think of nature writing, perhaps we think of someone like Thoreau by Walden Pond, who's really invested in his relationship with the natural world. But in Walden, Thoreau is not aware, it doesn't write about anthropogenic climate change or how human interaction with the planet is affecting and changing and damaging the planet. That's not an awareness or a concern in Walden. Thoreau wasn't aware that we're living in what is now known as the Anthropocene. That is the measurable, this time period of a measurable effect of human activity on the planet, from carbon emissions, the Industrial Revolution, the advent of agriculture. So many write about this idea of the human activity that has gravely affected the planet. And many poets write about this as well in a genre that's known as clipo, for climate poetry, which is more focused on anthropogenic climate change than eco-poetry, which is poetry that exhibits an ecological awareness and engages with the world. And eco-poetry really grows from the long-established tradition from the classical pastoral to 18th century landscape poetry, romantic celebrations of nature. Eco-poetry and clipo, however, can be distinguished from traditional nature poetry by their emphasis on the interconnectedness of human and non-human life in a time of unprecedented anthropogenic planetary damage. So this rise in the popularity of clipo and cli-fi has really energized the environmentally oriented branch of literary studies called eco-criticism. So who are some of the authors that I'm talking about? So in fiction, there's just so many. These are four of my favorites: Barbara Kingsolver, Kim Stanley Robinson, Richard Powers in his most recent novel, Bewilderment. And I love Lydia Millet's novel, Children's Bible. In fact, 2 chapters of my current book manuscript are on flight behavior and a children's Bible. Some of the terms that get discussed when talking about climate change, they're quite varied. I thought I would just tell you a couple of these ideas that often circulate in novels, fiction, poetry, such as these. So one is a literature of anticipation. So that is where authors are imagining a situation right now where the novels or poetry are set in a recognizable planet right now in the biosphere, the environment seems to be now, but there's an anticipation and awareness that things are changing and that perhaps we're going in the wrong direction, but a disaster hasn't happened quite yet. That happens in literature of catastrophe, where we already have reached the tipping point. Literature of catastrophe tends to be a bit more speculative than literature of anticipation. Literature of catastrophe is set usually more in the future, where it is projecting ahead to what life will be like if we do not address, adapt, remediate now. Another idea is Rob Nixon's idea of slow violence. Rob Nixon is at Princeton University, where I got my Ph.D. And he talks about climate change as slow violence, whereas this is a more slow accretion of damage being done over time that maybe we can't feel the immediacy of, except when there's something like the vast forest fires in California or the hurricanes that have been intensified by climate change. But in general, there's just sort of a slow buildup, which makes climate change hard to grasp, hard to understand how to experience this when you could go days, weeks, months without actually feeling it. I just had a student in class yesterday tell me that he feels there's no discussion about the Earth or climate change until Earth Day in April. And I was sort of astounded by that because that's so much of my teaching and research right now. But I realized if that isn't part of your everyday conversation or circle or social group, yeah, he might not think about it until April when Earth Day activities come around. Climate change also affects how writers portray regionalism or the local. So many writers want to invest their fiction or their poetry with a sense of the lived experience in the biosphere, the biome, the ecosystem of where we are right now, to invoke a specific sense of place, for example, by landscape, people, food, culture, dialect. But climate change can complicate portrayal of the regional or the local as climates change. As the American Southwest, for example, becomes more drought-stricken, or as sea level rises in Miami, for example, a sense of the local will change. And so it raises interesting questions for the literary imagination. How does one portray the region or the local when it is changing? But also when we have different adaptation mechanisms, such as wind power, solar arrays, seawalls that are being built, how actually does the local landscape or the regional change because of technological infrastructure meant to protect us from incipient climate change? So these are, ways that authors are thinking about how to engage with ideas of the local. And finally, another idea that is often bantered about is themes of socioeconomic inequality. And that is of great interest to me and two of the current books that I'm working on. So in general, wealthier nations enjoy a high carbon lifestyle and investment portfolios that are reliant on the fossil fuel economy. Poor nations have a lower carbon footprint, but will suffer sooner and more intensely as our planet heads towards a tipping point. So we do have a green gap based on income inequality, which is a big theme in much of Cli-Fi. And again, I'm really writing about this, and my students are extremely interested in this, and they really feel the overlap of climate justice with issues of climate change, specifically regarding socioeconomic inequality. And Pope Francis teaches us that climate change is a poverty multiplier. But not all Cli-Fi is doom and gloom. There is another sort of strand within climate change literature called solar punk. And solar punk is an optimistic genre that imagines solar power as our main energy source. It's where the literary imagination really gets us to think about the future and project ourselves into a radically revised environment based on a switch to renewable energy. So they're very positive stories that have assumed we've already weaned ourselves off fossil fuels, and there's this a life of bounty because we have renewable power. But what is so punk about solar punk? Isn't punk supposed to denote anger and like rage at the machine or rage at the system? So punk is an ethos that implies rebellion against or negation of a dominant paradigm and everything oppressive about it. So since our world is threatened by our addiction to fossil fuels, solar punk rebels against structural pessimism. The genre is not a dystopia, but it's full of hope that we can indeed transition to renewables and have a healthy, positive, green future. I assign solar punk to my students so that they can see what it would be like to project into the future, but in a way that is full of bounty and health and green. I'd like to now focus on a couple of passages and a couple of pieces of literature just to give you an idea of what it might look like and what my students are interested in and what we talk about. It was hard to pick just two examples because there's, of course, so many. So I just thought I would pick a couple authors that I really enjoy. One is Paolo Bacigalupi. He's perhaps most famous for his novels, The Wind-Up Girl and The Water Knife. And in my class on climate literature, we teach The Tamarisk Hunter. It's a short story by him. It takes place in the near future when the American Southwest has turned into a desert. Our hero is a man named Lolo who rides a camel around Utah and Arizona because that's the best form of transportation in a desert. And because of water shortages, the water is really rationed in this the society in this story. But one thing that threatens the water supply are these plants called tamarisks, which have deep roots that really suck out the water, any underground water from the water table. So to try to save water, the government has this plan to hire people called water ticks who go around and kill tamarisk plants, dig them up and poison them in order to try to preserve any underground water. So the passage that I thought we'll take a look at in 1 second is from Lolo riding his camel around, and he comes to the top of a hill of a mesa and has a view over it. And it kind of reminds me of sort of romantic moments and romantic poetry like Wordsworth arriving at Tintern Abbey, where then you can reflect on a landscape and it causes some introspection and connection with nature and the natural world. But that's not what happens in Cli-Fi. So let's take a look at this passage. Lolo tops another mesa and stares down at the familiar landscape of an eviscerated town, its curving streets and subdivision cul-de-sacs, all sitting silent in the sun. At the very edge of the empty town, 1-acre ranchettes and snazzy 5,000 square foot houses with dead stick trees and dust hill landscaping fringe a brown tumbleweed golf course. The sand traps don't even show anymore. I like this passage because we see Lolo, we're kind of with him on his camel as he's at the top of this mesa and staring down. So with students, we discuss, why is this landscape familiar? What makes it familiar? Is it because it's all sand, like so much of the desert landscape that is the story is set in? Or is it that the town, the eviscerated town, is really familiar because there are so many that have been abandoned due to water shortage? And the word eviscerated is good. Sometimes students have to look that up. You know, that's really been gutted, sort of torn out, desiccated, dried up, just really violently ripped apart. It's curving streets and subdivision cul-de-sacs. So we often pause there to make sure students are all familiar with subdivision cul-de-sacs. It's kind of really specific. It almost marks this passage as really American in some ways. I've taught this passage in Europe, and students are a little confused by what is a cul-de-sac in a subdivision. So we, can quickly call that up on Google and see what this looks like. So in general, subdivisions are, as you know, built all at once by developers, sort of a warren of streets that maybe have one entrance and one exit, but they're all kind of planned together. It's community oriented. So if an entire subdivision is eviscerated, that means 50 or 200 families and homes really had to abandon their property and their investment all at once. And they're all sitting silent in the sun. Nice alliteration there. But at the very edge of the empty town, there are 1-acre ranchettes, another sort of American kind of architectural feature, and snazzy 5,000 square foot houses. So those are big. Those are very substantial. At the edge of the town would be these different types of homes. And again, all abandoned with dead stick trees and dust hill landscaping, right? That's not the type of landscaping that developers put in a development with dead stick trees and dust hills. So it really has a visual for us to feel what this looks like. I love the verb fringe. We don't usually think of the word fringe as a verb, but it fringes a brown tumbleweed golf course. The sand traps don't even show anymore. Students tend to be really interested in that, and especially if they understand that if the sand traps don't show, it's because the entire place is covered with sand. It's like sort of one big sand trap, one big sandbox. And to have tumbleweeds on your golf course, that's very atypical. So I think this is a good passage to look at to understand how the landscape is imagined here and why perhaps these towns have been eviscerated due to climate change. Another author that I really admire is Barbara Kingsolver and her novel from 2013, Flight Behavior, which I've actually published on, and it's a chapter of my forthcoming monograph. Flight behavior takes place today in Appalachia, and it's about the migration of butterflies, monarch butterflies, on their way from Canada to overwinter in Mexico. But because of planetary warming, their compasses, their sensors have gone off, and they are misdirected to overwinter in Tennessee on the farm and woodlands of our heroine, Delarobia turnbow. And they don't know why. The people in Tennessee don't know why the butterflies are overwintering there. They don't understand what has happened to the climate. So let's take a look at this one passage where the unease of the planet mirrors the unease of our protagonist. She's going through a difficult time right now, and it's really beautiful how Kingsolver is able to link planetary devastation to emotional upset of a character so that we can better understand what's happening in the biosphere to the ecosystem by sort of understanding the ecosystem of our heroine. So let's take a look at this quick little passage. After maybe centuries of survival, the tree had simply let go of the ground, the wide fist of its root mass ripped up and resting naked above a clay gash in the wooded mountainside. Like herself, it just seemed to have come loose from its station in life. The ground took water until it was nothing but soft sponge, and the trees fell out of it. In such strange times, they may have thought God was taking a hand in things. I really like this passage because we have this tree that has been rooted for such a long time, but because of the heavy and unusual rainfall in Tennessee due to anthropogenic climate change, the ground has become so mushy, it's so soft that the trees just sort of uproot themselves by toppling over. So like this tree that had been rooted for so long, our heroine had felt really rooted, but now she's beginning to change and beginning to have some aspirations for an education, some dissatisfaction with her marital situation. And so the tree just seems to simply let go of the ground, the wide fist of its root mass ripped up and resting naked above a clay gash. It's sort of violent words, isn't it? Just sort of ripped up and this clay gash, similar to what our heroine feels, just sort of ripped up and exposed naked with her deep thoughts and emotional distress. So like herself, it just seemed to have come loose. So it's close connection between the tree and the heroine and just coming sort of loose from their station due to unusual activity. I like the last sentence. In such strange times, they may have thought God was taking a hand in things. This is important because the town in rural Tennessee where the story takes place is very religious, and they do tend to interpret events through a religious lens. And so the people of the town feel that this, it's almost like a punishment from God, that the heavy rains have destroyed the crops, affected the sheep farming, washed away the gravel, and is having tremendous mudslides that are destroying property. And it's distressing to feel that they're punished by God for it, that God is taking a hand in such things if you have this providential reading of bad weather. And it's only slowly that they become educated onto the climate science of what is happening. And that's where our heroine begins to understand the climate science as well. And so it frees them from thinking that they are being punished in some ways. So when I tell people I teach climate literature, they ask, isn't that a hard topic to teach in an English department? Yes. I would concede that, but I would also say that the humanities has a deep experience engaging with difficult knowledge. For example, we in the English department, along with my colleagues in history, philosophy, etc., we have taught difficult topics like women's studies, gender studies, African American studies, ethnic studies, native studies, gay studies, and other fields where joy, yes, for sure, joy, but also violence and intolerance can characterize the subject matter. In other words, to teach about climate change is also to teach about power, bias, and injustice. all matters that Pope Francis wants us to learn as part of our Jesuit education and mission. Students need to understand fact-based climate science, but facts alone are not enough to bring about change. Standard thinking is that if given enough facts about climate, people and systems will understand for the need for change. But we know this just isn't true. The facts of climate change are well documented, as Pope Francis reminds us. Skepticism is actually a cognitively reasonable way to cope with being overwhelmed with guilt about our addiction to fossil fuels. While students need to understand fact-based science about greenhouse gases, the ice albedo effect, feedback loops, etc., literature can also make an important contribution to student learning by helping students imagine how it feels to live in a changed world and how students can respond meaningfully to what they are learning. Interpersonal communication, relationships, discussion, and dialogue, really dialogue, those are major tools to move us forward for social justice and for what Pope Francis calls for in his encyclical, for us to care for our common home. And that, I would say, is what we model in the literary classroom when we have a conversation about the characters and their lives that we become enmeshed in. Also, as the U.S. Department of Labor can tell us, there will be many careers in sustainability and climate policy and adaptation over the next few decades. So climate change literature, CLI-FI, CLI-PO, can help students train for jobs by practicing critical thinking and life-affirming soft skills that will be necessary as our economy turns away from fossil fuels and towards renewable energy. There's been a lot of research on the neuroscience of resilience, and it shows us that our brains seek pleasure. And so we continue to do something when it feels good on some level. So I hope that by reading and engaging with relevant literature can spark joy and pleasure, which then becomes a methodology of resistance. Despair ends up serving as complicity in the status quo of our carbonized culture. So literature can help us feel pleasure in imagining the bounty of what Pope Francis calls the climate as a public good. It'll be rewarding to continue to see climate change taking center stage as an important and urgent topic for novelists, playwrights, poets, journalists, and filmmakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rosenthal. We really appreciate you sharing your research with us and taking time out of your day. And I can speak for everyone. John Carroll is truly fortunate to have you within our community and teaching the next generation of Blue Streak alumni. So thank you. I want to remind everyone, feel free to utilize the chat for any questions you have. I have a couple that I'll start off, and then I'll get to your questions if you have any. So the first question, Dr. Rosenthal, after studying climate change for a semester, do students experience despair or anger? And if so, how do you teach a course for a whole semester that can lead students to feel doomed about the current state of the environment?
Yeah, it's a really great question, and one that I'm really, really mindful about. I don't want the through line of my courses to be, we are doomed. So we have to find a lot of joy in what we teach. One way is through solar punk that projects us into a positive future. Another way is I pick stories that actually have a lot of humor in them, but I also try to model dialogue. That's where we can really find community. And if you don't feel alone in your despair, that's how we move forward, is finding other like-minded people. Now, these students also today really are students that experienced the pandemic, and they saw how basic needs like mental health and access to technology and safe housing did take precedence over academic learning and career advancement. So they saw that in some ways the pandemic actually benefited the planet, like the waterways and air cleaned up, and thus environmental stewardship is real. And they saw we can take action. There are ways to really help. And they saw how what we took for normal before the pandemic failed so many people. And students want a new normal. They learn best when we all learn best when we feel relevance between the topic and our lives. So if we can make our studies really relevant, if climate change is relevant to their lives, then they become more invested in it. And if students do feel a bit despair or doom and anger, I also try to remind them, you're feeling this despair or anger because we love. If we didn't love the planet, if we didn't love life and bounty and being outdoors, then we wouldn't really care what happens to it. So we need to create space for both and in the classroom, both outrage over governmental failure to meet emission reduction targets, and also hope that the current generation of young people can help us move towards net zero emissions and other climate solutions. So I try to position literature and the humanities classroom in general, this would be a bid for all humanities, to create the conditions in the classroom for conversations to be productive and to help students desire and not fear their future.
Great, thank you. We're getting a number of questions in the chat, so why don't I just jump right into those so we can get to all their questions. How does Cli-Fi portray battery storage as a new renewable power?
Yeah, that's really cool. We see that in solar punk also, and there's a couple of really interesting stories that really focus on battery storage, battery energy, and some even have a really cool idea about sort of more off the grid kind of living. And if smaller communities can have the control over their own battery storage and actually then be able to even get financial payback if they don't use the electrical, the limits set on each family, or you can, do energy exchange. So batteries are really cool. Actually, another book that I'm editing is called Teaching Energy Humanities. And so there's a lot of interesting work and proposals being done on the rise of batteries and how that figures in historically, not just the history and sociology of science, but also with literature. So I'm really excited to see what's going to be coming out of that from an energy humanities point of view, as well as just from a hardcore literary point of view. But it's definitely a topic of interest to writers.
Thank you for that. Now a lot of questions about book recommendations. So is there one story or text that you would recommend for a general audience? What would that be? And then diving into a more specific audience, what recommendations would you have for students who are not yet in college, so for the high school or middle school students?
Oh, great. There's just so many that it's hard to pick one. I would say the one that's on my brain the most is Barbara Kingsolver's Flight Behavior. My students really like it, and Kingsolver is a very famous writer of, sort of high literary genre, prize-winning author. So she has a great appeal. Many know her through the Poisonwood Bible, and she actually just published a book last week, Demon Copperhead. I haven't read it yet. It's only in hardback. I'm going to wait till it comes out in paperback because I put a request in for the library, but I'm already like 200 in line. So Barbara Kingsolver for sure. And Flight Behavior, my students really like because the protagonist is 28 years old. So she's not that much older than my students. And she did get pregnant in high school and had to make a decision and married her high school boyfriend, sort of things about life that my students can really relate to. A novel that I really love also is Lydia Millett's A Children's Bible, and that is about children who are younger. They are in high school. So I can see that being appealing to high school students now because of the age, except it's really dark. That's the problem. I actually had a couple of my students read the novel outside of class, and they thought it was just a little too dark. So I have to wrestle with how do you recommend a novel that, might be a little too disturbing. But there are a lot of Cli-Fi works for middle school, sort of AYA, adolescent and young adult audiences. I actually don't really read those because I don't teach them, but I know they are out there. I probably should just read them just in order to know about them, but I tend not to put them on my syllabus. So I'm really not familiar with for much younger audiences than teenage and college.
Great, thank you. So again, going into kind of other areas, is cli-fi unique to American literature? And if it's in more of a world literature sphere, do you know of any books that are kind of the ones that, you know, other cultures maybe look to for cli-fi?
Oh, right, great. Actually, cli-fi is very popular in Australia and in England, and from what I understand now in Germany, it's becoming more popular. So there's a lot of British novelists, and Ian McEwan, for example, with his novel Solar, and there's many others, Australian writers as well. I actually have a book out from the library now by a recent German writer. But it's interesting, I have talked about cli-fi in other countries, and I was asked this question actually in Moscow when I was lecturing on cli-fi, and the Russian students said they actually would enjoy climate warming because it would get Russia to be, you know, a little warmer. And they wanted to know why America was producing so much cli-fi when America was the biggest producer of fossil fuels, you know, except for China. And you know, that is part of that, you know, in this country, we can critique ourselves without fear, you know, usually of government repression about it. So they were really interesting that one of the biggest polluters is also the biggest producers of this kind of fiction. So I hope it will be increasing around the world as other countries and other authors really become aware. And in some ways, you could say that almost all literature being produced now maybe should have some sort of awareness of what is happening. You know, it's sort of hard to ignore at some level.
Great, thank you. In thinking about how you teach our students, how do you go about handling or working with students who are skeptical on climate change?
That's a really interesting question. And students that I have taught at John Carroll, at least they have not come out and said that they are complete denialists, because I do teach this course with a biology professor. So students are learning the science of climate change. So if they entered the course, perhaps doubting, we hope perhaps by the end of the class, they will have understood the science behind it, and therefore what our authors are influenced by. But in their final essays, reflective essays, I do have them respond to a short story by Helen Simpson. She is a British author, called In-Flight Entertainment, that features a conversation between a denialist and a climate scientist. And it's a really interesting dialogue and a way to sort of model how a denialist and a scientist might speak to each other. So in this reflective essay, which students need to write, I asked them to imagine that they were the climate scientists speaking with this denialist and how they would address the concerns, because it's really important that students maintain close and loving relationships with their relatives. I would say almost all of my students say that they have relatives who are denialists. And of course, you don't want to cut off your beloved family relatives because you have a different, you know, sort of understanding of science. That's just not, you know, necessary. So it's really important to maybe model for students how to listen, how to understand what the other person's concern is, and then to discern where you want to intervene if there's anything that you want to say. So that's really part of what we're hoping to accommodate with student beliefs and encourage students, you know, how to enter the conversation.
Thank you. Another one, this one kind of goes into sci-fi a little bit. Sci-fi like Neil Stephenson foreshadowed the Twitter sound bites and video clip evolving news to superficial communication, which I think we all know we have very short attention spans right now. How are novelists capturing and engaging the short attention span to the complexity and interdependence of the energy transition?
Yeah, that's a really great question also. Some authors really encourage us to stay with it, to read more slowly, to become deeply engaged. Others do critique the, sort of news cycles. One specific example would be actually in flight behavior, where two women from England fly over to Appalachia. So there's sort of a criticism of them wanting to be climate activists by taking a jet airplane. And the way they try to raise awareness about the plight of the monarch butterflies who are overwintering in Tennessee rather than in Mexico because of a changed climate is they are craftivists, which means they use their skills making crafts in order to post on social media. So they knit little butterflies and then decorate the mountains with knit butterflies and then take pictures of the butterflies and post them on social media. And Kingsolver kind of critiques their slacktivism by making fun of the way they are just counting the number of likes they get for their posting pictures and how many retweets and shares. And there's a kind of a funny scene in the novel where they are described as sort of showing peace signs like, hey, like loving from, and they're reading off the names of the cities that are liking their postings. So while it is important to raise awareness, I think Kingsolver wants us to kind of wrestle with this. It's really important to raise awareness. And one way certainly is through tweets and retweeting and posting on social media and resharing. But we have to ask what is actually happening and what are the mechanisms behind it? What are the socioeconomics of flying over in an airplane and having a smartphone in order to do this? Because our heroine has never been on an airplane and can't even afford a smartphone. So the kind of level of activism that these British women are doing is out of reach for someone who in a lower socioeconomic situation who is not able to even participate in social media in this way.
Thank you for that. We're going to do two more, and then I have one last question more about what you're working on now. So, what is the value of fear in, as in this topic representations of climate collapse, as compared to that with pleasure as a motivator for change behavior?
Such a great question. It was just on an exam that I gave students last week, which is better, the carrot or the stick? Basically, is it better to scare people into taking action against climate change, or is it better to show a future world that we could have if we wean ourselves off fossil fuels? And I think 90% of the students went with fear. And I was really surprised by that. And they just really thought that fear is a better motivator, that it is better to have sort of dystopian, Hunger Games type of warning against what could possibly happen, rather than a positive model of what we can reach for and what we can achieve. I was really kind of surprised by that. I don't know why. Maybe I shouldn't be surprised, but I was sort of hoping that they would go more for the positive. The final assignment for our course, which draws upon the climate science and the biology class and my literature class, the students have to come up with a movie pitch. They don't film the movie, but they come up with a pitch for a movie. My colleague and I pretend we're Hollywood movie executives ready to give out millions of dollars to whichever student has the best movie pitch. Almost all students come up with disaster films also. There really aren't that many films that show a positive future that we have escaped. Only a couple in the past have, where there was a Back to the Climate Future movie. So as you know that movie, that you're sort of projecting ahead and going backwards. There was a Christmas Carol type movie, a climate carol about the ghost of climate past, ghost of climate present, ghost of climate future. But other than that, most are kind of disaster films because students feel that is a better motivator.
Wow, that's 99% is a lot. That's a big number. And the final question from our chat actually kind of segues really well into what you just shared. As someone who's aspiring to write cli-fi, do I need to learn a lot about the area in order to be realistic and engaging?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question, because some of the highest grossing films are ones where the science is inaccurate. For example, Kevin Costner in Waterworld. The plot of that is all the polar ice caps have melted and the entire planet is covered with water. Like, that's just not scientifically true. the whole planet is not going to be covered once everything melts. So for example, that made billions of dollars, or whatever, how much money it made, but it's not scientifically true. Oh, and Kevin Costner grows gills, like human evolution isn't quite that fast. Snowpiercer is another example of a high grossing film that's the science is just not right. The entire planet is not going to freeze evenly like that. The train is zooming around the planet and there's no change in bioregion anywhere. So it's a hard question to answer because, this sells. Maybe the scientific accuracy isn't important. In our class, Waterworld and Snowpiercer would get an F because it shows the students haven't learned anything about scientific accuracy. So I don't know. I would just, I would say go for it. We need more Cli-Fi out there. We need more engagement. From my point of view, I would prefer if the science were accurate, because otherwise it could lend itself to charges that climate change isn't real, because look, this fiction isn't real, or the planet isn't really going to be totally frozen with a train running around it. So maybe since that's fake, maybe all of climate change is fake. So I personally would prefer fiction, poetry that reflects actual understood climate change, that accords with IPCC predictions. But but if that's not where your motivation works, or if that's what the story, a different direction is taking you, go for it.
Thank you, Dr. Rosenthal. And would you finally share a little bit about what you're working on now?
Sure. So I'm working on 4 books right now. One is my own monograph, so my single authored book. It's called Root Economy, with a play on, root and economy, contemporary American climate fiction and class politics. And so this is where I'm really interested in how contemporary novelists portray socioeconomic inequality. Because of that interest in that topic, I'm also editing a collection of scholarly essays on that topic for the University of Virginia Press, and that we have 13 different scholars who are addressing a very similar topic. Everything it's all been written, I've been edited, it's shipped to the publisher, so we are expecting a production schedule soon. The major literature and language organization in my field, the Modern Literature Association, MLA, has a series of pedagogical volumes to help professors, teachers who want to learn strategies for teaching a certain topic. So there's how to teach Romeo and Juliet, Beowulf, strategies for teaching French literature. So I am editing for them a volume called Teaching Climate Change Literature. And I have 33 contributors who have written about all sorts of different topics and strategies for teaching particular novels or approaches, or how to incorporate podcasts into their classroom. And then I'm also editing for them another volume called Teaching Energy Humanities. So energy humanities is slightly different from climate change. I mean, yes, they both have to do with energy, but a quick example I like to give for the difference between climate change and energy humanities is think of innovations that were made in the theater. If, for example, in the 19th century, before the advent of electricity, theater productions needed candle lighting in order to get patrons into the theater or to light the stage. But once the advent of electricity with energy, that could change theater production on stage. But it's not quite the same thing as climate change, right? Just electrifying a theater, yes, you could say what kind of energy does it draw upon, but it's not quite the same thing as anthropogenic climate change and fossil fuel emissions and sea level rise, right? In having a new technology to help with artistic creative productions.
Great. Well, thank you again, Dr. Rosenthal, for being with us today. We really appreciate you taking time to share your research. It's wonderful to have you. And before we say goodbye, I want to let you know about a few other programs that you all can take advantage of in the next few weeks. On Monday, November 28th, Marcus Gallo, Ph.D., Associate Professor of History at John Carroll, will explore the life of Alexander Hamilton, deciphering the truths from the fiction that is contained within Hamilton the musical. This program will be hosted on Zoom. Later that week, JCU turns its attention to the holiday season. The university and the JCU Alumni Association has a number of programs and events for you to enjoy. The first being on December 3rd, as our New York City Alumni Chapter will host its annual Mass and Brunch at St. Patrick's Cathedral in downtown Manhattan. The following day, join us on campus at the JCU community gathers to light the university Christmas tree and welcome Santa to visit with alumni and their families. On December 10th, jolly old St. Nick will travel to Chicago for the annual Murphy's Breakfast with Santa at the Union League Club of Chicago. And finally, that evening, our Buffalo Alumni Chapter will host its annual Mass and Social. You can find out more about these programs and other programs at jcu.edu/alumni. Additionally, we invite you to view the recordings of our previous programs on our JCU Alumni Association YouTube channel. This program will be is being recorded and will be added to that library in the near future. To view our extensive library, search for John Carroll University alumni on YouTube. Finally, please consider a charitable gift to John Carroll in support of our students, our outstanding faculty like Dr. Rosenthal, and our entire campus community. If you've already made a gift this year, thank you for your generosity. If you have not, please join me in supporting John Carroll so that we can continue to deliver an outstanding education for our current and future Blue Streaks. You can make a donation by visiting jcu.edu/give. Thank you again for joining us. Take care, be well, and onward on John Carroll.